Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining the session today on employee and change communications, returning to work, change communications, and hybrid workforces. Very topical. Businesses across the world are starting to return to the office either as we speak or at some point this year. And I'll hope the next 40 to 50 minutes will be interesting for you, that there might be some food for thought to help you put together a successful change communications plan. So I am joined today by Steve Cremando, who I will hand over to shortly. Steve Cremando is the principal and founder of Behavioral Science Applications, an operational risk management consultancy. Steve is a certified threat manager, a certified homeland protection professional, and a board-certified expert in traumatic stress. He's a consultant and educator focused on the human element in security and emergency management. So that's what he'll be talking about today, the human and psychological factors that you need to consider when thinking about a return to work change plan. And then you'll have myself. I'm Linda Block. I'm part of the management team at Snapcoms, driving our business strategy as the advocate for employee communication and engagement best practices. And in a previous life, I worked in management consulting with a focus on change management strategy for technology implementation. So I'll share some of my learnings from working with different business leaders and how a focus on employee engagement can accelerate your business outcomes. So let's look at the agenda today. Steve will start by looking at how workplaces have changed as a result of COVID-19 and what those changes mean for employees. He'll discuss the importance of change communications and how employees typically respond to change. Then we'll switch over to me and I'll introduce the new Engage to Excel change framework and take you through how we can align business goals and employee needs. And then we'll finish with some practical communication examples and opportunities during times of change. And change has really been the key theme in 2020, and this is going to continue in 2021. And as opposed to the unexpected scramble in 2020, where it was all about surviving, this year organizations have had the chance to, or still have the chance to, front foot the change. For many organizations, returning to the office is imminent, or you may have already started to roll out some initiatives. So we acknowledge that 2020 was reactive, but 2021 is the year to proactively and intentionally shape the future of work, which will likely include some hybrid workforces. And I believe most of you will be in internal communications or will be HR professionals. So you will know that to make this work, you'll really have to have a robust change communications plan. And you'll also know that really good communication starts with empathy, really understanding the state of mind that your employees will be in, what are the different emotions they might be going through, what are some typical behaviors when dealing with change. And this is where Steve comes in. He'll now take us through some of the employee needs and how to build that empathy and understanding for employees. So over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for joining us. You know, when we think about the ideas of thriving and surviving, one name that often comes to mind for me is Charles Darwin, and really Darwin's work going back now certainly more than 100 years ago. And the observation that really wasn't necessarily the strongest of the species, the most intelligent of the species that survived. It was those that were most adaptable to change. And this is a real test for organizations and for leaders in all kinds of organizations. How will we manage the change? How will we actually encourage and support adaptation to what is next for all of us? So this is kind of a historic challenge, one that certainly seems to have spanned mankind for the millennia, and it's really in focus for us right now. You know, Linda said it well a few moments ago, this idea that 2020 was all about somewhat of a reactive change. We're all thrust into a brand new situation. And if we think back to the very beginning of the pandemic, if nothing else, the operative word really was uncertainty. That from a behavioral science standpoint, the single greatest driver of stress and anxiety is actually uncertainty, not knowing what's next. But that's the nature of a pandemic. By definition, it's a novel disease, a novel virus that we don't know anything about, and certainly attacks all of our systems globally. But that anxiety does not necessarily subside very easily or very quickly. And one lesson we all learned over the last year or year and a half is that pandemics are predictably unpredictable. There's always going to be the next change, the next news blast. There's always going to be more information, sometimes misinformation, and even rumor that does influence people's behavior. And after a year of new everything in terms of how we lived and how we worked, the invitation for new anything can seem very unwelcome. So we may be excited. We may be very much in line with the idea that here's an opportunity not to be reactive. Here's an opportunity to be proactive and shape the future of business. But that does not necessarily mean the workforce is as enthusiastic about that after a year or a year and a half of almost constant change and the sort of stress and anxiety it creates. So it may turn out that leaving the office was actually a lot easier than getting everyone successfully back to the office. Everything about how we lived and everything about how we work obviously has changed, and very significantly over the last year or year and a half. And for many people, work changed at a very fundamental level from a place to go each day simply to a thing to do, regardless of where we were. You know, it's been years in the making that our technologies have really liberated us from necessarily being in one place to conduct our work. But that idea really was stretched to its limits during the pandemic, and people obviously have been able to work from literally anywhere. So when we think about the traditional model of work, designated locations, full-time being in the office, pretty much the same routine every day, and being fairly administratively simple with staff right at our fingertips and easy to reach out and communicate with, certainly the shift to the hybrid model changes all of those expectations. People literally are working from everywhere and anywhere, sometimes in hybrid models or in the office some of the time, from home sometimes, but every day may be somewhat different. So therefore, that becomes much more of an administrative challenge and can make staff more difficult to reach in any given moment. But this model, this hybrid model, seems to be what employees are expecting, thinking, and maybe in some instances even demanding going forward. We look at this quick report from Global Workplace Analytics, and 25 to 30% of the workforce expects that they'll be working at least a few days each week from home or off-site. Now, from a psychological standpoint, it's interesting to apply a very, very fundamental concept, which is the idea about how we respond to pain and pleasure. And I'm not speaking here just about the pain of going to work. I'm speaking more specifically about pain associated with change, the unknown, the source of stress, that uncertainty that we all seek to avoid. It's interesting, when we first got into the pandemic, lots of leaders said, try to get back to a routine. And we know that, as simple as that sounds, routines create certainty. Uncertainty creates discomfort. People would like to avoid that discomfort, and as I'm referring to here, pain, at almost any cost. In fact, what we know psychologically is people will go to much greater lengths to avoid pain than actually receive or gain pleasure. So again, administratively or strategically, we may be thinking about all the great opportunities for our organization, for our workforce, really for everyone involved with our endeavor in this new future ahead of us. But people again become comfortable very fast. And to shake them out of that comfort zone, to get them back to this new hybrid workforce or whatever's next for your organization, actually does create that distress and discomfort for people, that pain. And regardless of how we spin it, their perception is their reality. Now, the good news is we know that this changes over time. And the more time that goes by, the more this levels this phenomena, and people start to really, again, settle into new routines and new realities. But if there's any level of fear that comes back into equation, This may have to do with news reports of a new variant or changes about vaccination, but there's any new news that represents a threat, we know that our survival response actually overwhelms all other sorts of logical sorts of thinking. And we know again that we can't appeal to people just purely on logic. There is so much going on at a kind of deeper psychological level that, going back to Linda's term earlier, we do have to understand and have that sense of empathy for where people are coming from. So one of the most useful ways that we can talk about anticipating change and then creating strategies and approaches to dealing with these changes as we see them is really in the graphic we'll explore in this and on our next slide. And a few things to keep in mind first. Psychologically, returning to work will be a process, not an event. This will not be like flipping a switch and automatically people are back to their old routines, back to their old ways of working in the office. This will take a period of time to reacclimate to that environment, and it will be different for everyone. Bottom line, people respond to change in their own time and on their own terms, and it will be different across the entire workforce. People are going to have to reacclimate to the environment, being in an office, being out of their home, maybe getting dressed in different ways to return to work, being around coworkers. And we've been in these Zoom environments, we've been in different video sorts of environments for more than a year, but being shoulder to shoulder with people around the conference table in these environments may be very, very different for people over the next several months. Adjusting to schedules, where people have enjoyed so much flexibility of when they start and when they end and how they take their breaks. We know from the statistics and some of the surveys that people are actually working longer hours while they're working from home, but they're working them really into their own schedule and their own lifestyle. And that may change very suddenly. The commute is something that most people have been able to skip for the last year or so. And having supervisors literally in our environment, perhaps looking over our shoulders, will be something new for people to acclimate to. So there are a lot of foreseeable changes, some more foreseeable than others, but let's jump ahead to our next slide and start digging into the phases of change that we can anticipate and we can actually plan for. If we start at the top of this dial and we move again in a clockwise sort of direction, we'll talk about stage one as being people going through a loss. So let's talk about what people will be losing in the near term by returning to the traditional workplace. Well, some degree of autonomy, flexibility. We spoke about the commute, maybe again a different model of supervision, but they're going to be changing and losing what many perceived was an unprecedented level of freedom in their work. And many people are not going to give this up very easily. They may be slow to accept this. They may be, again, cautious, and some people may be outright resistant to that. But as I said, in the last slide or so, time does modulate this. Time does smooth this process. So how quickly people move from stage to stage is going to be very, very specific to the individual, the organization, and all sorts of factors going on around us. But stage two is a little more openness, still tinged with doubt, and sometimes a resentment. Someone is doing this to us. They're making me go back to this workplace where I'm not 100% sure or confident yet. And I may be somewhat resistant as we move into and through this phase as well. There's going to be a degree of skepticism to see how it works out, how we're being protected, and how we're being, again, really managed in this new environment. So stage three is characterized by a level of discomfort as people start to come to grips with this new reality. We can see anxiety in this change because it's an in-between stage area where still people don't completely have their footing underneath them. And it could also reduce productivity. So that's something, again, for leaders and managers to keep an eye on. But this is also a tipping point. This is a danger zone where organizations and leaders can either make it or break it, because if we can continue to push through, we very often come into a stage of discovery where people start to appreciate the changes, start to understand how they may be benefiting everyone involved, and get more energized, more really, again, more committed to their work, and in some ways more productive as well. So as we move around this cycle into stage 5, the understanding, the deep understanding of how this will work and how it benefits us all really starts to set in. And lastly, in stage 6, an integration where we see really a flow from the old to the new, and a level of comfort in which people are open, they're generous, they're satisfied, and they're potentially working near their peaks. But we do anticipate some reasonable obstacles. This is not necessarily a smooth path. There will be lingering concerns about people's health risks, how, again, working in close proximity to other people will be. If there's news, again, of new variants or other sorts of health concerns, that will not necessarily subside immediately, even with the success of the vaccine campaigns. There will be some residual emotional distress about the disease, about moving back into the workplace, about all the change that's on the horizon. And there may be some also general social awkwardness about being around people in large open spaces again, really just being in that traditional workplace. It will mean adjusting to new routines. It may be working in different sorts of environments that are more stimulating or noisy and more difficult to concentrate in. And for some people, they're really not going to settle down for a while, and we may have a period of time of general nervousness and unease. So it's important that leaders and managers develop the ability to recognize the warning behaviors of individuals who may be struggling. And here we're talking about these as signs, not symptoms. These are not necessarily deeper problems or indications of any sort of more significant psychological problem. They are very much the normal reactions that people would have to somewhat of an abnormal situation, leaving the traditional workplace so quickly a year or more ago, and now trying to integrate. So it's going to be different for different sorts of people. And we should try to avoid comparing people to each other, and actually discourage people from comparing themselves to each other, because, as I said, a very important concept, people will work through change in their own time and on their own terms. It could be demoralizing for people to think that others are doing so much better than they are in terms of adapting. So we have to appreciate that almost every aspect of functioning, decision making, problem solving, logic, judgment, reasoning, communications, relationships, they all change with the sorts of stress and the sorts of behavioral ripples that are caused in a change environment. A very helpful approach for leaders and managers may be one of supportive acknowledgement, letting people see or know that you see when they struggle. Let them know that you appreciate the source of their concerns and struggle. Don't dismiss it, don't ignore it, acknowledge it, but in a supportive way, and let people know you're there to help. And as I mentioned, these behaviors should not be seen as indications of bigger sorts of social or psychological problems. They very much are the normal course of reentry or change into a different sort of environment. We also know there's a pretty substantial gap between the viewpoint of the employer and employees. In a survey, again, looking at this difference of opinion, employers, CEOs, other leaders, 83% said that they completely wanted employees to get back into these traditional workplaces, back to the office. But in those same studies, only 10% of employees said that they wanted to come back to that sort of setting. How the employee perceived it and how the employer perceived it were very, very different. And the employers and their leaders tended to be very focused on the upside of potential change and return to the office, while employees tend to be more focused on the downside. It will take some time and it will take some work to close that gap. But closing that gap is done primarily through communication. So we know the two keys to success here are going to be communication and the ability to adapt to these changes, adaptability. Communication, again, open management style communication is going to be 8 times more important in this environment to lead to the success of individuals making this transition from the pre-COVID and the COVID environment back to what is hopefully a post-COVID environment and a return to the traditional workplace or hybrid sorts of environments.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for giving us this really thorough overview of how employees deal with change and pretty much covering the human element and the employee perspective. But of course, there's a business perspective as well. We need the right business structure in place. There are logistics, processes, policies, communication plans. So let's look at the business perspective and how we can combine both employee and business needs. So Steve just covered the track at the top here, employee response stages, moving from loss, doubt, discomfort, discovery, understanding to integration. So that was the wheel we just saw. And then we have the business needs stages. And there are various different change frameworks out there, but it typically looks something like this. You'll start off with an initiation phase. That's where you're establishing a foundation, you're kicking things off, you're starting to socialize the change. And then enablement, initial processes are being set up, pilots might be rolled out. Acceleration, some processes are already fully resourced. Overall resistance is being minimized and you're slowly getting more acceptance of the change. Then in implementation, things are coming to fruition and you can start to see some of the outputs and deliverables already. And finally, sustainment. Things are pretty much business as usual. We have a new normal and we're pretty much getting ready to do it all over again with a new change because we know change is constant. So for each of those steps, I'll now briefly cover the messaging at each of those business stages. So number one, initiation. Focus on messaging that builds awareness while addressing employee well-being and morale. So as an example here on the right, you can see a leadership alert, a video message where you could be sharing some new initiatives to build awareness. Then number two, moving on to enablement. Focus on enablement messaging to build employee knowledge and drive commitment. And the example you see here is multi-channel. So likely you will need some form of detailed communication like an email to inform employees of potentially quite detailed new guidelines, planned and procedures. Sort of a step-by-step guide, but also be sure to reinforce those messages in bite-sized and more visual formats. Not all employees are going to read your emails. Often they will just barely skim them and then immediately forget what they actually read. And at SnapComms, we actually recently conducted a study with HR leaders, and one of their key pain points was that they had to repeat themselves over and over again. So even though they've written it all down and they shared the new guidelines on email or they had it on the intranet, and then they're still dealing with the same questions from employees over and over again, the same concerns and objections. So that's where I'd recommend diversifying your communication channels and think of it more like a marketing campaign where you actually need to promote this change with advertising tactics. So short, clear messaging with simple language, repeated visually in a screensaver like you see here, for example, and this will actually drive subconscious awareness of your message. So without actively looking for the information or without rationally processing the information, employees will be exposed to your messaging and eventually it will sink in that, well, okay, this change is actually happening. It's that constant reinforcement through different channels at all times. Then number three, acceleration. Focus on messaging that regulates emotions to maintain momentum while minimizing seeds of resistance. And an example we have here is an employee wellness newsletter to continue to show support for your employees that might have a bit of a harder time adapting to the change. Then phase 4, implementation. So that's where you should focus on positive reinforcement and sharing of quick wins to build support and advocacy. And the example we see here is a screensaver again. A screensaver is a great channel to share wins and more inspirational messages. If there are some other important office procedures that employees now need to be aware of, like wearing masks in certain situations, for example, using a ticker could be a really good way to reinforce those new protocols. Then 5, sustainment. Focus on ensuring compliance with new processes and embedding the post-change state into regular business operations. So a common example here might be new health check-ins that might now be required, or your specific country or state might now have new regulations where you have to capture your employees' vaccination status. So make sure that you choose a channel that makes it really easy and seamless for your employees to fill out those surveys, especially if you need them for compliance purposes. And now let's look at this new framework that the team at SnapComms have developed, the Engage to Excel framework that aligns employee psychology with the business needs stages. And the base for this framework, just go through here. The base for this framework is the traditional employee change curve. So that is the wheel that you saw earlier, and that's that emotional roller coaster that employees typically go through. And then on the other axes, we've plotted the typical business readiness stages that I just covered off. So those are exactly the 2 tracks we just looked at earlier, and they're both overlaid on a scale of time. So from beginning of the change to the end of the change. And if the employee state, emotional state, and the business readiness stages are aligned, you can broadly think of having 3 phases which make up the name of the framework: engage, educate, and excel. So in the engage phase, where employees are going through this roller coaster ride up and down, and the business is still in the early planning phase. So we call this phase engage because you should really focus here on a lot of empathy and engagement. So be mindful of not overloading your employees at this stage with all the details and all the practicalities and processes, but rather acknowledge the anxiety and uncertainty that they may be feeling, right? So build that trust and engagement up front. It's like when you've had some really tough personal news and you're feeling really emotional, a breakup or some other tough news, and you pick up your friend, you pick up your phone to call a friend, and at that point you just want them to acknowledge your feelings, someone that listens to you and makes you feel understood. You don't necessarily want practical advice at this stage. You just want someone to acknowledge your feelings, and as business leaders we can do the same at the start of that phase. However, eventually, the business has to ramp up to implementation, and we need everyone to get involved. We need to ramp up our education appropriately, providing the right resources, training, and to fully equip everyone to contribute and be productive. And this happens in the educate phase. And then in the final Excel phase, hopefully things will be a lot more effortless. We're getting our first wins, we're getting that momentum, and from experience, it typically only happens if we have taken the time at the start to ease employees into the change and to build that trust and engagement up front. So let's look at what happens if the tracks are not aligned. So if the business, for example, is well advanced in the journey, you're already seeing physical changes to the office environment, already new procedures are being rolled out. But then on the other hand, employees are still in denial. They're still actually doubting the change, and they haven't quite digested that they will need to leave the comfort of their own home, and they will need to work without their pets next to them, and that the change is actually about to happen. So in that case, your communication really need to pivot immediately to address that denial and make sure your implementation isn't derailed. And we'll cover off some more specific examples later on. And hopefully, though, you will have enough time to plan this out upfront, and you can use this framework to identify these type of objections and risks and opportunities and plan for them in advance. And so this is where we've identified 5 key moments across this journey. So starting with build awareness, number 1. When the change initiative is launched and employees experience the first shock, that's where you want to focus on acknowledging those emotions and have a variety of different communication formats and channels, including shorter and multi-channel communications. Then once employees are more aware of the change, objections will start to bubble up and you'll need to address those. Then as the business is accelerating, employee resistance is going to rise. So this typically happens once changes become really tangible and visible, like processes or roles are starting to change. So be ready to deal with more resistance here. Then 4, foster support. In the Excel phase, you have an opportunity to highlight your first wins, to showcase your change champions, tell some good stories, and foster support. And then finally, in the post-change state, you'll need to review and communicate what the new normal looks like. What are your new communication strategies and plans going forward? And then next, again, a little bit more detail for each of those 5 key moments. We've identified communication opportunities with relevant messaging strategies. And I'm not going to go through each of those in detail. We will send out a white paper where you can look at all of this in detail after the session. So let's just look at one example here. Number 2, overcoming objections. If you want to overcome objections, you need to provide clarity and increase engagement. And as a messaging strategy, FAQs are really great. Ideally, you'll have them in different formats, not just email, but live videos, for example. Executive sponsorship is really important, hearing those messages of clarity and empathy from your key leaders directly. Video trumps written communication. It'll add this additional level of richness and empathy and humanize your message in a way that plain email just can't. Show your support with wellness and newsletter resources. Really think about how you can enrich your messages, repeat them in different formats from different leaders, and make sure employees can access the information in the channels that they prefer. And finally, a few notes on addressing employee objections. I think we've hammered the point home now that objections to change are inevitable. It's human nature to feel cautious around new things and to prefer the status quo. But it is possible to counter and address employee objections before they manifest as resistance that could potentially derail your project. So in this chart, we're listing a number of possible employee objections in the middle, and outward from there, we have the business response and then the recommended communication tactics. And again, for today, we're not going through everything, but just having an example here. Let's zoom in on this one. One of the most common objections to returning to centralized work is the risk of personal health, like we heard earlier as well from Steve. Will I be at a higher risk of infection if you make me go back to the office? So the business response here is that physical precautions and process improvements have been introduced to protect everyone's health and safety. So this is where you might want to highlight that you have an office roster, social distancing and cleaning protocols, mandatory health check-ins, and so on. And the communication tactics could include sharing a CEO video, reassuring staff of what's being done, but also offering two-way communication with a survey to identify that extra precautions that your employees would want to see. So if you do get a chance, keep an eye out for the white paper we'll send you, and cross-check with your existing communication plan if you already have one. See if you've addressed all the objections, or whether you're covering off all the different channels that your employees might want to engage with, or whether there might be some more alternative channels that will help your employees digest this information. And we're pretty much at the end here. I hope that this was helpful, and that this lens of combining both the business and employee perspective has been interesting. Maybe it has sparked some new ideas or made you think of your communication program in a different way. as with every framework, it's just a framework. Life and business are a lot more complex than a few PowerPoint slides, but a framework can be really useful to start a conversation with your business leaders and your leadership team, and to start creating that shared understanding amongst everyone. So I will conclude with a quick summary. Make sure that you have a change management program of some sort as part of your return to work plan. Consider how you might want to address both the business and employee needs, even visualize both journeys to help identify opportunities and risks, and then address those by planning your internal communications in advance as much as possible. And that's it from us. Thanks for your attention today. Please reach out anytime. You can see our details on screen here. Steve, any final words from you?
Linda, I just wanted to focus in on your theme and how important it will be, especially at this time, to lead with empathy. I think how that's communicated, I think that employees get that message on a consistent and ongoing basis will be so fundamental to the successful, moving forward for all sorts of organizations and communities. So thank you.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. I don't know where to stop recording.